afternoon. My name is Chris Stanke. Welcome to the Brown Bag History Lecture Series sponsored by the History Department of the University of Nebraska at Kearney. The series is offered in partnership with History Nebraska, the new public face of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Lectures are held on the second Wednesday in selected months at the Kearney Public Library. A schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the History Department's programs, can be found at www.unk.edu/academics/history. To learn more about History Nebraska and our programs and services at historynebraska.gov, you can head to that website, history.nebraska.gov, and if you are not already a member of History Nebraska, I encourage you to join. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the UNK History Department and the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs. And finally, if you would like to watch any of the 170 plus previous Brown Bag lectures, visit the History Nebraska YouTube page at youtube.com/history/Nebraska. See playlists on that website. There you will see a subsection labeled Brown Bag Lectures. And our speaker today is Dr. Elaine Nelson. Dr. Nelson is the Charles and Mary Caldwell Martin Professor of Western American History at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, where she teaches courses on the American West, Native American, and women's history. After graduating from the University of Nebraska at Kearney with a Bachelor of Arts in History and English Education, she received an MA in History from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and a PhD in History from the University of New Mexico. Her published work has recently appeared in the journal Great Plains Quarterly, and her book, entitled Dreams and Dust in the Black Hills, Tourism, Performance, and Memory in America's National Memory, is forthcoming from the University of Oklahoma Press. Nelson also currently serves as the Executive Director of the Western History Association. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nelson.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. I want to thank the UNK Department of History for inviting me here today, and also the Public Library for hosting the Nebraska Brown Bags series this year. So I graduated from UNK with my undergraduate degree. So it is always good to be back in Kearney. Today I'm honored to speak before some of my old professors, or should I say former professors, but they really profoundly shaped my interest in history and my intellectual conversations about the past. I would not be here today without my education at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. In 1885, arena announcer Frank Richmond climbed to the top of a wooden platform and asked a crowd of 20,000 people for their, quote, silence and attention. After careful instructions and a brief pause, a cowboy band offered up a spirited version of the Star-Spangled Banner. And almost immediately, hundreds of Native Americans, cowboys, vaqueros, and others on horseback filled the open-aired stage. The crowd cheered excitedly. The air smelled of gunpowder, animals, and dirt. Colorful costumes swirled around the dust-filled arena. The applause rose to a deafening level and drowned the sonic booms of blank cartridges and horse hooves pounding on the earth. And then, there he was, adorned in an embroidered magenta hunting shirt and white sombrero. Buffalo Bill Cody rushed into the center of the group. He responded to the cheers with his long hair flying in the breeze. He tipped his hat, bowed, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the equestrian portion of the Wild West exhibition." The sound of his voice resulted in thunderous applause and cheers. They loved him, and he knew it. Government servant, king of all men, frontier hero, first worldwide celebrity, Avenger of Custer, Chief Scout for the U.S. Army, most famous American, etc. What, if anything else, can I add to all of these titles? Fascinating might be one word to describe William F. Cody. Born in 1846, he was a child of the Iowa and Kansas frontier. He became a writer for the Pony Express, a trapper, a Civil War soldier, buffalo hunter, cavalry scout, and fought against Native Americans. At the age of 23, he was a famous dime novel hero, and at 26, he starred in his own New York theater drama. 10 years later, Cody created the most successful Wild West show to tour the world. By 1900, over 1 billion words had been published about him. His life overlapped with the Civil War and decades of territorial expansion in the United States, two of what I believe are the most pivotal moments in American history. Cody's generation witnessed massive changes in technology, transportation, territorial boundaries, and social reform. He both celebrated and participated in many of these transitions. But this time period, more than any other, also marked decades of violent encounters between various groups. Chinese race riots in the West and Pacific Northwest, lynching and abuse of African Americans and former slaves in the South, political unrest between immigrant groups in the Northeast and Midwest, and the reprehensible labor practices toward people of Mexican descent in California and the Southwest. The populations that experienced the most concentrated damage in the late 1800s, however, were Native Americans. They lost thousands of lives to warfare and disease, in addition to the dispossession and suppression of their land, culture, and freedom. The darkness of this chapter in U.S. history serves as a foundational period for understanding the American West. Yet the majority of people at the time viewed these decades as a celebratory badge of honor to mark a conquest that was simply part of the country's destiny. No matter their interpretations, these events definitely played a role in how William Cody transitioned from a Civil War veteran and buffalo hunter into the dime novel hero and stage character of Buffalo Bill. Much like the interpretation of historical events on the frontier, Cody's real life and mythic persona became intimately intertwined. Today, I'm going to talk about how Cody utilized myth and the art of storytelling to sell an idea of the American West, an idea that continues to persist today. I'll explore this by looking through the lens of performance, Cody's own performance, and that of the massive cast who worked with his Wild West traveling exhibition. And before I dive into that, it would probably be helpful to explain this place called the American West. There are a lot of different ways to define the West as a place. For example, where does it start and where does it end? It's a fun game to play with your students. I have an ongoing debate actually with my husband. He's a Missourian and also a Western historian. He swears that the West starts in Missouri, which I just say, and smile. And as a South Dakotan myself, whose parents are both from Nebraska, I don't think that this is true at all. Then there are people who believe that the West starts at the Rocky Mountains, like all of my friends who never leave Colorado. Does the West extend into Mexico? Well, it certainly did at one time. And what about Canada? Absolutely. The establishment of international borders turns this dialogue into an interesting exchange. Is California part of the West? They don't think so. Of course, though, I do think so. And what about Alaska and Hawaii and the Pacific world? How far does the West go? And then you must consider that the West cannot be designated by direction, like for the Chinese, who arrived in large numbers during the California Gold Rush. To them, the American West was east. For Mexican populations, it was north. Indigenous people in North America did not necessarily recognize this place as the West. It wasn't west of anywhere. It was simply their home. These conversations are as amusing to explore as they are important to consider. I believe they reveal more about the American West than just its placement on the map. The West as an idea, or as it exists in our imaginations, has much to say about how we understand its place in American history. Now, a lot of people are responsible for shaping our views of the West. But I argue that William Cody, through his character Buffalo Bill Cody, which is a character, played the greatest role in defining the American West as an idea, and he did this through the powerful tool of performance. Drawing on romanticized versions of certain people, events, and places in the past, Cody became the most famous and the most influential storyteller of the American West. Cody's Wild West exhibit promoted the West around the country and the world for 3 decades. He hit over 1,000 US and Canadian cities and 12 European countries. He drew on his experiences in Western territories and later his theatrical performances to inform his creation of the most successful Wild West show. Each season, it included a cast and crew of between 700 and 1,700 people. They loaded themselves on 2 to 3 trains of 50 or more cars each, along with 400 horses, 20 buffalo, dozens of elk, donkeys, deer, mules, and Texas longhorns, numerous stagecoaches, costumes, tents, food, weapons, props, rope, instruments, grandstand seating for 20,000, and their own traveling fire department. In all, there are estimates that it cost $4,000 per day to operate the show. Now, if you're thinking this sounds a little like a circus, you would be correct, but Cody was adamant that his Wild West was not a circus, and rather he believed it was educational and based on realistic portrayals of historic events. So I'll return to these claims of authentic and realistic, but first, if Cody declared an educational value for this show, what did he want to educate his audiences about? In an interview conducted in 1892, he reminisced on his reasons for starting the Wild West show. He said, quote, "My longing for the wild and exciting life of the far West returned to me, and knowing that the days of such a life in reality had passed away, I determined to organize the company to represent it and show the people of the East what the life in the far West had been." So there you get an idea of his audience. Cody desperately believed that his version of the West, buffalo hunts, scouting, trapping, horseback ridings, and violent encounters with Native Americans, would disappear if he did not preserve it somehow. He viewed himself as an ambassador of historic preservation for Eastern populations who only knew about the West from newspapers and popular dime novels. So, he continued in his interview, I proceeded to collect Indians, cowboys, scouts, trappers, buffalo, and perform the West as a, quote, realistic representation. It was, he claimed, a decided success from the start. My initial performance spread like wildfire. Cody's show was indeed a success. There is no doubt that this was due to, in large part, to his staged presence and the convincing performances of his diverse and varied cast. The Wild West gave thousands of shows between 1883 and 1913. In 1899, for example, Cody, his cast, and crew traveled over 11,000 miles to perform 341 shows in 132 cities across the United States. They did this in just under 200 days. Much to the excitement of crowds in New York, Baltimore, Richmond, Washington, D.C., Nashville, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Boston, and Philadelphia, the Wild West started with an extensive parade, as you see here, down major city streets. It included the diverse cast of Native Americans, cowboys, Arab performers, Annie Oakley, Mexicans and people of Mexican descent, Cossacks, Irish Lancers, stagecoaches, and soldiers from France, Germany, and America. Journalists favored the spectacle. One noted, quote, "It was as if the wild regions of the West had mustered all their queerest denizens clothed in holiday dress and sent them forth." The parade served as a teaser for the actual show. This was, of course, a tactic to sell more tickets. Crowds waited in lines for hours, despite the expense of attendance for a typical working-class family. With adult and children's tickets at 50 cents and 25 cents respectively, the cost for a family to attend the Wild West could be at least $2. Add food, programs, souvenir, and beverages to this, and expenses piled up quickly. It doesn't sound like a lot to us today, But in the 1890s, $2 could cost a week's worth of groceries or other necessary supplies. The combination of posters, flyers, and the parade itself proved to be an effective advertising campaign. After seeing the parade, children begged and harassed their parents into attending Cody's show. These adults were also easily persuaded by newspaper coverage. Most reporters claimed that there was an urgency for people to see Cody's exhibit. You have to see this. It was like, he claimed, one journalist claimed, an educational and realistic and genuinely American. They warned the public, the journalists did, that those who skipped the show might never be able to see anything like it again, because the people and animals living on the plains were quickly vanishing and would become extinct. This cautious tale drove hundreds of thousands to purchase Wild West tickets each summer. There they witnessed the performance of their much beloved characters. One of them, the king of the Cowboys. This was William Levi Buck Taylor, who was a crowd favorite in the early Wild West tours for his horsemanship and roping skills. Buck Taylor exhibited, quote, great strength, nerve, endurance, and skill. But more than anything, he, quote, looked the part, striking, handsome, tall, and a man among men. In reality, he was actually a real cowboy. Before he joined the Wild West tour as an employee, he herded cattle to and from Texas and North Platte to Cody's ranch. Now, Buck Taylor's life, like all cowboys at the time, was one of hard labor. But once he stepped into the arena, he shed his work clothes and displayed a brightly paired shirt and handkerchief along with an embroidered hat. He was a sensation, and he set the standard for how audiences thought cowboys should look and act. In reality, Americans knew very little about cowboys and cowboy culture at that time. They actually didn't much care for them, and they viewed them as distrustful, immoral, and violent lowlives. But Cody's cowboys, their performers, flipped these stereotypes on their heads. Their performances of horse trickery, bronco riding, and roping skills, which they actually learned largely from Mexican vaqueros, placed them in high regard with audiences and improved their image. But within a few years, creative imaginations saw cowboys as romantic heroes who ushered civilization into the supposed wild frontier lands. They quickly became essential to Cody's dramatization of the frontier and pioneer history. Men, women, boys, and girls cheered as characters like Buck Taylor, Billy Bullock, and Bronco Bill Irving performed acts of bravery by riding at full speed across the arena stage. These cowboys stole people's hearts. It is important to remember, however, that Buck Taylor set a standard for later cowboys who joined the show. Real working cowboys plucked off ranches, like those in western Nebraska, turned into performing showmen. Although the early tours included cowboys who were African American and of mixed indigenous and Mexican descent, populations that were indeed a large part of the demographic of real cowboys on the trails, the Wild West exhibit cowboys evolved to reflect Buck Taylor's look, his look, handsome, tall, and white. Cody believed that this is what the audience wanted. Despite the preference to hire white cowboys and to separate racial and ethnic groups in the arena, Cody's show was still the most diverse Wild West exhibition on tour. He employed hundreds of Native Americans, and he also recruited Russian Cossacks, Mexican and Mexican Americans, Cubans, Hawaiians, Filipinos, and Japanese, French, German, and Arab people to perform alongside an ethnic mixture of men and women from varied European and Euro-American ancestry. It is important to note that the cast was not segregated from each other behind the scenes. Many white men were married to Native American women and had mixed-race children who traveled with the show. Cody and his publicists were not always comfortable answering questions about interracial families in the cast, so they created a PR spin and turned the white men into cultural mediators who were respected by both Native and white communities. Through Cody's performance and storytelling, the creation of a mythic drama far outweighed a portrayal of a realistic American West. Now, despite this diversity, Cody's Wild West left out important populations that represented both urban centers and rural landscapes through the American West. Chinese performers were notably absent, even though many toured with other travel shows and fairs at the time. And African American cast members were very few and far between in Cody's Wild West show, even though they too traveled with other Wild West shows at the time. A diverse spectrum of women, though, were seen in the cast, were absent from the cast, and with a few exceptions, Native and Mexican women were relegated to props and background village scenes. The exceptions, sharpshooters and trick riders. The most famous woman to tour with Cody's Wild West was Phoebe Ann Moses. And what do you know her as? Annie Oakley. Moses, or Oakley, was not a Westerner by Cody's definition, nor by mine, because she comes from Ohio. Her skills represented what we sought from both male and female cast members, the mastery of a so-called Western activity or sport, such as shooting and horse tricks. Born as the fifth child of a mother who was twice widowed, Oakley was a natural with guns from a young age. Her family's survival depended partially on her hunting success. She was so good that she often sold extra meat for money, and Oakley only improved with age. At 4'11", she was a remarkable shot and found ways to use her skills as public entertainment. This eventually drew her to Cody's Wild West show. It was pure, wholesome entertainment. Oakley's casting in the Wild West was a happy accident. She auditioned in 1884, but was turned down because the show already had one sharpshooter. In a twist of fate, that sharpshooter, who was a man, fell ill the following year, and she re-auditioned. The show manager, Nate Salisbury, was so impressed by her genuine talent that he offered her the job. Much of the shooting acts from the era were a mix of artful deception, mirroring, magic tricks instead of authentic skill. But Oakley was an exception, and the Wild West cast knew it. She shot clay pigeons and stationary targets in the show better than any other cast member. Such a performance from a short, petite woman surprised audiences. She broke their assumptions that firearm expertise was purely a male trait. While she performed this typically masculine skill, she also performed her femininity. She took careful aim to make her entrances graceful and even pretty. One reporter noted, she never walked, she tripped smoothly, bowing, waving, and wafting kisses. Known almost overnight as the Little Sure Shot, she wore dresses both on and off the Wild West stage. She looked, by all appearances, to be a proper lady. But when she started shooting, she shocked audiences. Women especially screamed with fright at her rapid skill to flawlessly perform both masculine and feminine characteristics. Oakley's capabilities won her many admirers. Who could not love her? According to one publicist, she was a modest little girl who shoots like a man. Buffalo Bill Cody knew he had a novelty act on his hands with Annie Oakley. He did not hire her out of any desire or obligation to make the Wild West tour more inclusive to women. And once she was hired, he knew that the show could benefit from the performances of several women. And for him, this benefit was about a profit. Even though it was rare for the show's management to advertise any single cast member, Oakley received her own publicity posters and flyers. This encouraged other women to actually join the show, including sharpshooter Lillian Smith. Some of the trick riders over the years were also women, such as Della Farrell and Georgia Duffy. Their participation was never more than 10% of the cast, but they did earn their own small place in the Wild West souvenir program. And this is an excerpt from the program. I'll just read here. The real cowgirl is a development of the stock-raising West when compared with the, quote, bachelor girl and the independent woman of the East. She is not of the new woman class, not of the sort that discards her feminine attributes, simply a lively, athletic young woman with a superfluity of nerve and animal spirits, with a realization that in affairs where skill is the chief qualification, she has an equal chance with her brothers. Although women's performances received considerable attention while on tour, they posed somewhat of a challenge to Cody's Western drama. How did women fit into Cody's story of the West? He was a supporter of women's suffrage, but he held little to no regard for the roles that they played in Western expansion. And this holds true also for minority women, so women from Mexican American, Chinese, African American, and Native American populations. For Cody, women existed in the spheres that were separate of domesticity. He was happy to have them on board to tour, especially if they made a profit for him, but there really wasn't a clear place for them in his storyline about the duel between, quote, civilization and savagery. But Oakley, and this is an image of her later in life, she held a different view. As the highest paid cast member on tour, second only to Buffalo Bill Cody himself, she viewed her performance as an opportunity. She made it her second career to teach other women how to use guns, not only for sport, but to defend themselves. She believed women should learn how to handle guns properly, as well as they handled babies. It is estimated that over the course of her life, she taught 15,000 women how to properly use a gun. Cody's Cowboys were the most popular. Annie Oakley was the most beloved. But there is absolutely no doubt that the participation of hundreds and hundreds of Native Americans made Cody's Wild West a long-standing success. Cody was an astute showman. He recognized the vital importance of Native Americans in his dramatization of the West. In his mind, after all, Native nations represented the quote-unquote savage wildness of the West that American progress fought to tame and civilize. This portrayal of them is terribly problematic, yet they became the most important characters of Cody's storytelling performance. Cody realized from his theatrical career in the 1870s that indigenous characters captivated audiences both on stage and off. Before the advent of Wild West shows, Native peoples from numerous tribal nations earned money to conduct mock buffalo hunts, war dances, powwows, and other short performances all over the country, from Niagara Falls to Fort Robinson. And this is beginning really in the 1860s. Many of them were Indian scouts who entered the entertainment industry of theater. As a result of their popularity on stage, Cody stopped using what were known as supers. And these are white extras who dressed as Indians on stage. And this was very common in the 1800s. And he shifted his attention to the process of hiring actual Native Americans to perform Native American roles. The result of his pursuits certainly impacted his theatrical shows, as it allowed him to edge out his competitors. But more importantly, Cody's employment of indigenous people this early on made him appear to have strong relationships with Native Americans from his time on the frontier, when in fact, he did not have strong relationships with Native Americans. In reality, Cody knew very few indigenous people until after his Wild West exhibit gained popularity in the late 1880s. The Lakota men that he invited to the stage in 1877 only joined his production through the recruitment efforts of a mutual acquaintance who happened to be married to a Lakota woman. But this small act of hiring Native actors instantly enhanced Cody's performance as true, authentic, and heroic as he tried to encapsulate that character of the Western frontier. In addition to this rise in credibility, Cody's use of Native Americans started to edge out other entertainment venues who continued to rely on white supers, the whites who would dress up as Native people for the stage. This had the added impact of his ability to successfully market and sell the American West to Eastern and European audiences. By the late 1880s, Cody recruited Native American cast members almost exclusively from the Pine Ridge Reservation in then Dakota Territory. It is important to note, however, that these Native men, women, and children were paid employees who signed contracts through their reservation agency. Sometimes there is a misconception that Native Americans were happy to serve as performers for these shows on a volunteer basis. But like all traveling shows and exhibitions, Cody's Indigenous cast was paid for the time spent on each season's tour. They were hired according to the season. So every year, if they wanted to rejoin, they would have to sign a new contract. The process of employing Native Americans sounds like it might be simple, but it was not. Cody, or the show manager Nate Salisbury, could not just go to the Pine Ridge Reservation and hand out employment contracts. In order to secure members of tribal nations for their show, they had to pursue permission from the Office of Indian Affairs, known today as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The OIA commonly resisted such requests from traveling show exhibitors. But why? Reasons for this have to do with U.S. federal Indian policies of the time. The 1870s marked the beginning of the systematic process of a, quote, civilization project of Native Americans, known on the federal level as assimilation, yet today known as colonization. This project included major policies dealing with land seizure, boarding school education for Native children, and training in the practice of agriculture. At the same time that the U.S. government forcefully encouraged new ways of life, they vehemently restricted all aspects of tribal practices: hunting, native languages, traveling, dancing, singing, gathering, clothing, and the list continues. Even religious practices were outlawed on most reservations. If Native peoples violated any aspect of these policies, like trying to hide their children or speak their own language, they could face severe punishment, prison, or their rations and annuities would be withheld for extended periods of time. According to government officials, this multi-tiered project would ultimately civilize Indigenous people in the ways of mainstream white America. Needless to say, assimilation resulted in emotional and physical trauma, as well as devastating losses of land, children, and tribal traditions. Contemporary Indigenous nations are still trying to heal from these atrocities. In light of these massive changes placed on Native communities, the Office of Indian Affairs was not necessarily receptive to requests to hire Native peoples to dress, speak, sing, and dance in traveling shows. Such behavior, they claimed, worked against every aspect of federal assimilation policy. The OIA, the Office of Indian Affairs Commissioner, claimed that it kept them from agricultural pursuits and encouraged the practice of their traditional ways. In 1890, the Pine Ridge Reservation agent reported that the Wild West show business was, quote, a growing evil of permitting Indians to be taken from the reservation for show purposes. The injury already done is irreparable and will prove a curse to these people for many generations to come. And just to be clear, he wasn't just talking about Cody. There's a lot of Wild West traveling shows in the late 19th century and early 1900s. Regardless of these concerns, the Office of Indian Affairs did comply with requests for hiring Native people. As long as Cody paid a security bond of $10,000 for transportation and paid transportation costs and food and medical care, the agency superintendent would give permission to certain Native peoples to join his show. Once established as a reputable traveling company, Cody's Wild West casting requests were always approved. Cody certainly benefited from this process. He knew that Native Americans in the Lakota Nation in particular would spark immediate excitement in the exhibit. He needed them, and they became the touchstone of his packed arenas. The public's fascination with Indigenous people never diminished. A man named Winston Roche recalled attending the Wild West and seeing Indians for the first time, and he said, "Buffalo Bill was my boyhood hero. When I heard he was coming and my dad said he was going to take me to see Buffalo Bill and some real Indians, well, that was amazing." He remembered cheering on the Cowboys and the cavalry from the show. Quote, "In the crowd, we were living our fantasies and imaginations, living them as part of the show." The most popular Native leader employed by Cody was Sitting Bull, who joined the tour in 1885. Even though government agents claimed that Sitting Bull was not allowed to leave the reservation, Cody was persistent. He charmingly persuaded them to allow the famous Lakota leader to join his show. This was not necessarily an emotional plea. It was a business decision. This was, he said, quote, "If we can manage to get him," meaning get Sitting Bull, "our everlasting fortune is made." Crowds, quote, "loudly and repeatedly cheered for Sitting Bull when he rode into the arena on his horse. Some believed he was more popular than Cody, and this was an issue that may have sparked some jealousy from the show's leader. Sitting Bull negotiated a remarkable hiring package for himself. He earned $50 a week, received a $150 signing bonus, and earned extra income by selling his photographs and autographs to the public." Cody's use of Native Americans in the Wild West cast them in severely limited ways. They appeared in over half of the acts in the program, in which they danced, sang, and rode in horse contests. But in the majority of their scenes, they continually performed repetitive roles as the attackers, villains, and antagonists in Cody's story. They killed Custer and his men at Custer's last stand. They attacked, quote, "innocent pioneers" in the Deadwood stagecoach scene. And nearly every performance ended with a climactic, quote, "attack on Settler's cabin," in which Native Americans approached a settler family and viciously attacked them, only to be then counterattacked by Cody, the army, and Cowboys, who swooped in heroically to save the day. None of these episodes were particularly accurate or displayed any kind of context for audiences. And despite the flawed interpretations, the scenes gained mass appeal, especially because in the end, Cody and the cavalry always triumphed. These scenes were exemplary of what Cody called, quote, "the savage resistance against the heroic deeds and patriotic devotion to the advancement of American progress." Here, the printed words was just as powerful as the show's living images. Cody's souvenir program was updated from year to year to reflect changes in the cast, but the rhetoric of each section rarely changed. In them, Cody lamented about the, quote, "passing of the American Indian." There seems to be, Cody's program read, quote, "no power on earth to save the departed red man. His doom seems to be fixed. His days on earth is apparently short. All seem to agree that his is slowly, surely going, passing from our gaze forever." This lamenting was a marketing campaign as well. Cody wrote, quote, "It will prove profitable to see these leaders of a dying people, for the day may not be far distant when all will have passed away." If the Wild West exhibit so clearly exploited the historical realities of Native Americans for profitable gain, then why, you are probably asking, would they agree to work for Cody? The answer to this is layered and complex, and not enough time in the day to really get into that, but I can go over a few examples. Many indigenous peoples later talked about their reasons for working as show Indians, and not just show Indians for Cody, but show Indians all across the country. But today, these comments are specifically related to Cody's show. There were claims that it was good employment and that it paid well, and it offered a temporary escape from the dire, impoverished, and restricted reservation conditions. A Lakota man named Rocky Bear said that the shows were, quote, "the way I get money. I saved money to buy some clothes for my children." Another Lakota man named Blackheart pointed out that he was raised on horseback. "That is the way that we work." And that Cody's show, quote, "furnished us the same work we were raised to. That is the reason we want to work with these kind of men." He continued that if white men had the privilege to work any place and earn money, then Native people should be able to do this as well. A letter from Chief Irontail to Pine Ridge agent also mentioned good treatment. Quote, "I will now write a few lines to let you know we are getting along nice with the show. Good fooding and clothing and everything. We are all fat and healthy because we are all under good care." Excuse me. Native performers earned anywhere between $25 and $50 per month, depending on their roles, while Native women earned about $10 per month, in addition to selling their art and beadwork to the show's attendees. The fact that Cody both allowed and welcomed Indigenous families to tour together was an incentive for some. For example, it might mean that their children could evade having to attend boarding school that year. Other Native Americans believed it was an opportunity to see and learn different things. Lakota Holy Man Nicholas Black Elk, for example, said he joined the show because, quote, "I wanted to see the great water, the great world, and learn the ways of white men." He said, if the white man's ways are better, then he would be more convinced to live that way when he returned home. There were also instances of Native American leaders who used the tour as an excuse to travel to the nation's capital in DC, where they could also then meet with lobbyists and congressional representatives to politically argue for the plight of their people's diminishing conditions back home. Wild West Native performers experienced a greater degree of freedom while on tour. They traveled without passes, came and went from their camps as they pleased, danced and sang both on and off stage. They were allowed to speak their languages. They freely socialized with each other among other cast members, and they were allowed to wear the clothing of their choice, except while in the arena when they were expected to wear their regalia costumes. In some instances, if the food was not to their liking, they made it clear. There are several occasions that they boycotted the kitchen until they and other cast members received better meals. Now, whatever their reasons, Native peoples were not forced to work on the Wild West circuit. And even if they tried the show for a few weeks and they disliked it, they could always have the right to request a train ticket to get home. Rocky Bear mentioned, quote, "If the show did not suit me, I would not remain any longer." With a few exceptions, Cody and Salisbury always made sure that they were paid for their work and provided with a ticket to return home. Sadly, there were documented deaths of Native peoples who toured with Cody, as well as numerous instances of illness. Now, Nicholas Black Elk's traveling experiences were mixed. He enjoyed what he called, quote, "the Indian parts of the show that they put on, such as the dances and the horse races. And he liked getting paid to perform brave deeds, but he did, quote, "not much care about the white people's parts." One scholar concluded that Black Elk disliked the fact that he and his people were always defeated in one way or another in Cody's arena. Yet the young man found himself homesick on several occasions and ended up feeling alone on the earth in what he was doing. So he returned home and carried with him lots of stories to tell his family and community. It is important to understand that Native performers were not dupes or sellouts or fakes. You might draw the conclusion that they used their employment with Cody's Wild West as a way to subtly fight back against what was happening with them and the severe restrictions that they faced at home. Since the Office of Indian Affairs was strongly against this kind of work, several Native people viewed their participation as a way to resist government policies aimed to destroy their cultures. Cody preyed on his audience's willingness to crave nostalgia. The American West, or what they imagined the American West to be, was disappearing, he said. This pulled on the public's heartstrings, and they lamented such a loss. It was this chapter of frontier history, they believed, that made America so exceptional from the rest of the world. This idea of exceptionalism was clarified early on by a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. In 1893, at the Chicago World's Fair, he delivered what became a prolific statement on American character, progress, and democracy. In the significance of the frontier in American history, Turner argued that the frontier had vanished, but that the closing of this chapter produced an exceptional country. The frontier, he claimed, was a process of rugged individualism and pioneer strength to overcome and conquer the so-called savagery of the West. In Turner's story, like Cody's, Native Americans symbolized that idea of savagery, while Americans symbolized civilization. While Turner delivered this speech to a crowd of about 100 historians, which is good for a historian, Cody performed a similar storyline to thousands on his Wild West arena grounds just outside Chicago World's Fair grounds because they wouldn't let him in the actual fair. Both men remained influential placeholders in the telling and retelling of Western history. But there was another important speech delivered at the fair. Simon Pokagon of the Potawatomi Nation delivered the red man's rebuke. His words challenged Turner, Cody, and others to reconsider the so-called line between savagery and civilization. And this is all a quote from Pokagon. "On behalf of my people, the American Indians," he said, "I hereby declare to you that we have no spirit to celebrate with you the great Columbian Fair now, being held in this Chicago city. No cheer of sympathy is given us, but in answer to our complaints, we are told the triumphal march of the Eastern race westward is termed the survival of the fittest. And so we stand upon the seashore, chained hand and foot, while the incoming tide of the great ocean of civilization rises slowly but surely to overwhelm us." Even though Pokagon's speech was the most widely circulated statement of its kind delivered by a native tribal citizen at the time, his point of view was often overlooked and remained in the shadows of Cody's grandstands. The story of the West continued, and even continues to this day, to be mostly dominated by this intellectual insight of Turner and the skilled storytelling and imagery of Cody. Their most flawed prediction was the disappearance of native cultures and indigenous peoples. These nations continue to persist, and like Simon Pokagon, they offer an important and critical reproach to Turner's and Cody's view of the conquest and so-called civilization of the American West. William F. Cody left a significant legacy across the world. Over the course of his show career, he became his show character, Buffalo Bill. He truly believed that his life was representative of the frontier experience and that he exemplified the men who stood between these so-called lines of savagery and civilization. Upon his death in 1916, he continued to defend his traveling exhibit as an authentic display of Western life. He remained steadfast in his position that the purpose of the Wild West was to, quote, entertain while educating the spectator. As a profitable enterprise, he showed the world romantic ideas about who and what existed in the American West. And 100 years later, we are still thinking, considering, debating, critiquing, and talking about this legacy. But here is when it is important to think about history as stories of the past. History is told different ways by different people. Cody's stories were not accurate or completely authentic. You could say the same about Cody himself, as he became the actual myth that his storytelling perpetuated. But this was the history of people, events, and places that he created for himself and performed for his audiences. To him, it wasn't a show, it was real life, and it was real history. Thank you. Questions?
The question about where the Wild West really begins, from an ecological point of view, the 100th meridian might delineate the short grass and the tall grass prairie, but probably where the Wild West begins is in everybody's imagination, not a straight line.
Absolutely. Yeah, the meridians are also up for debate. It's 98th meridian, 100th meridian. Some people get to the 102nd meridian. Environmental historians have really been at the forefront, or were at the forefront in, I would say, the 1930s. Walter Prescott Webb, Great Plains historian, is the one who is really trying to use aridity and the environment to decide where the West begins. And so one of the things that I teach my students is that Omaha and Lincoln aren't technically the West because all of these trees were imported. So we have to shift that line further west. They don't appreciate that, though.
In the courses that you teach, do you cover any of the predecessors to the Anglo-American settlers? Since I've been here at UNK, I've bought quite a few materials on the fur trade, the French, and their very different relationship with the Native Americans as opposed to what the Anglo-Americans did. Women were critical to the success of the fur trade. And fur traders often had families, sometimes a family in every tribe, which helped them become welcome.
I do cover that in my classes. I actually had an explorations lecture yesterday where we talked about the French fur trade and what happens in terms of how the French engage with Native people and particularly find Native women to be very beneficial to their hunting and trapping ventures, whether it's their individual venture or they're working for Hudson's Bay Company. So competition was fierce in Canada and then into the Great Lakes and then eventually into the Great Plains. And that could not have been successful for the French and later Euro-Americans without indigenous people. The Spanish are a little bit different. The Spanish are also engaged in using the rivers for trade, but they are going to be engaging with indigenous women in very different ways, less intermarriage, more efforts of conversion, and a lot more violence that takes place there. But I also give the disclaimer that no type of colonization in the end is good, but there were very different tactics that England and France and Spain and Russia all used when they came in contact with indigenous people. So it gives students a really interesting way of thinking of these things, not in generalizations, but in the fact that these were very real experiences that produced offspring, and that legacy with that offspring will produce domino effect of changes in the future.
I have to admit that my idea of the American cowboy has been greatly influenced by Buffalo Bill. You mentioned quickly in passing that not all American cowboys were white guys. Could you expound on that just a little bit more?
Sure. I learned that in a lecture by Dr. Mark Ellis back in 2000, right, Torsten? Torsten and I were in his class, so I think the title of his lecture is something about the golden era of cattle or something. The days of the range. I think that the statistic, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think it was something like 30% of cowboys in this sort of golden era, which would have been the 1870s and 1880s, were people of color. And so, or it was African Americans. I can't specific. Do you remember? 50%. 50% were people of color, men. A lot of African Americans, a lot of what you would say Mexican American or people of Mexican descent or mixed with Spanish as well. And so much of the cattle industry actually stems from the Spanish. And again, there wouldn't be a cattle industry without horses, which the Spanish bring. And so these influences, we sort of think of them as Great Plains ranches, but the influence of cowboys and the cattle drives are really coming from a lot of the Spanish borderlands from the south and then bringing it up north.
Would you comment for just a moment on the World's Fair or the Columbian Exposition and yet leaving the exposition outside when interesting interpretations of reality that some might think should clearly fit together but did not?
Are you asking why he was left outside of the fair? Yeah. So these World's Fairs, we hear the word fair and we think, oh, like a circus, like a lot of entertainment stuff going on. But these World's Fairs were about showcasing changes in American modernity, education, progress. So especially the Chicago World's Fair, they still had entertaining parts of the fair, but Cody did not fit. Cody did not meet the bar of sort of this idea that this is going to be a civilized affair. So his grandstands were seen as being more accessible to a greater population that might not get into the Chicago World's Fair. So again, he wasn't included in that, but 5 years later at the Trans-Mississippi Expedition in Omaha, they created a whole affair around Cody. And so Cody brought people from several different reservations actually that year, a lot of them from Nebraska reservations, not just Pine Ridge, but from several different reservations, and they had the Indian Congress. And the Indian Congress was its own sort of week-long affair within the Trans-Mississippi Exposition. So every fair is going to be a little bit different, but in 1893, Cody didn't meet the expectations of the fair board in terms of what they wanted at this fair. Again, they would rather showcase and platform an academic giving a 40-minute talk as opposed to cowboys and Indians fighting in an arena.
Well, that was then, and this is now. I mean, we'd certainly want to have a show today. I couldn't help thinking when you were saying that he may not have thought that the show was a circus, but that parade downtown to generate interest is exactly the way the circus has generated interest when they would come to town, is go down the street. I don't know who got it from whom, whether he got it from the circus or they got it from him, but pretty effective. I just wondered if you're familiar with a novel by James Welch, and I believe the title of it is Heart Song of Charging Elk, who is the character goes on the Buffalo Bill Wild West show, somehow gets left behind in Paris and then has to find his way back to the reservation. When he comes back, it's with the observations of what this experience all meant to him, and it's a pretty good read.
That book, but that did happen, that there were Indians that were left behind in Europe, and it took them a while to get back. And this was, I didn't go into a lot of the underbelly of several letters of Native families writing in, of being very seriously concerned about their relatives who are with Cody in Europe. There were several who died there. There were several who died in the East when they were performing. And to get their bodies back, or to just even get humans back, it was not a priority for the Cody and Company. But it was an adventure, to say the least, for the individuals that this happened to. And so I'm sure that this is based on the same story.
I suspect he had a factual basis for it.
I'm sure.
First of all, thank you so much. That was amazing. My question was, and I had no idea that there were Germans involved. I was born and raised in Germany, and that was really interesting to me. What was their skill? What did they do?
They were dressed in soldier uniforms and just marched. So that was their skill. That was part of what they did.
That was my thinking then, because the Germans just figured out who was German. They just made their empire, so to speak, and the only thing that they knew was militarism, right?
Exactly.
So Prussian militarism.
Yeah, it was a portrayal of the military. So they had military from America, from France, and from Germany. And they were just essentially part of the parade and part of the arena opening act, but not necessarily the skilled aspects. It was to show civilization and progress, not just in America, but in Europe. And when Cody takes this to Europe, Germans love it because they love and are obsessed with American Indians and with the West, and they create secret societies around this, and they have real tribes that they are inspired by, the Sioux and by all different other tribes. So yeah, Cody established really early on a tie with Germans.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
A local person, Jim Sailstrom, has done a lot of study on Buffalo Bill and what a showman he was, and how he was one of the first Kardashians, famous for being famous. But he also talks about how the Germans studied Buffalo Bill and how he could transport so many people so efficiently. And some of the war generals before World War I took notes and studied how to transport so much and so quick.
Not just people, but things and animals. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't use Kardashian, but I do say Brad Pitt. If you need some kind of idea of a celebrity, so that gives my age, right? So maybe I should say Justin Bieber. I'm not sure what the kids are watching these days, but he was a celebrity. The way we see people in the tabloids today, That was Cody, and there is, historical interpretations. He was America's first celebrity, the way that we think of celebrities today as larger than life. His divorce was covered completely in the tabloids. It was a ridiculous sort of he said, she said. It tore these two individuals apart in ways that we now see, and we're sort of desensitized to this now. No one had ever seen that in the 1900s. And so people were hanging on every word published about Cody. It was just, again, fascinating, this term that I use for him. So.
All right, please join me in thanking Dr. Nelson.
Thank you.